Okay, the recording has started. So this is the April 2nd, 2019 Crossplane community meeting. And the biggest upcoming uh, event that I know of is that we want to get to for today. We had been discussing a quarterly release cadence, and with our the first release being in December, then the March timeframe was when we wanted to 0.2. So we're a little bit behind that, and we want to hurry up and finish off that milestone and converge towards getting the release ready to be hopefully published by the end of this week. So I took a pass last night. And let me move this Zoom bar thing out of the way. I took a pass last night at the milestone. And so here's the project board here, but let's actually look at the milestone itself. So these are the remaining issues that I culled the milestone down to. I punted some items out that had been in there that were no longer a good scope or a good fit for converging on this milestone. And so not necessarily in this list here is everything, like, do we need to do every single thing, but at least they are items that I wanted to have discussions about as a community. So let's actually start at the bottom here. So I believe there's already a PR open for using a consistent logger across all controllers. And that may have even been approved recently as well. Yes, so the PR for using consistent logging across all controllers has been approved. Is there anything remaining on this PR, Nick and Ilya?
I was actually just thinking about getting you to take a look at it, and because I know that you had some feelings about logging, so wanted to see if you liked the implementation or had any concerns.
Yeah, okay, cool. That sounds great, Nick. I will make a note to make sure I take another pass at that. I haven't taken a pass since you took over that pull request, so I will take a first pass at that. Everything has to be written down these days, or I will not remember. Okay, sounds good. So I take a look at that today, Nick. Thank you for following up on that. Okay, the release pipeline. I kept this issue in the milestone since there were a couple of manual steps that needed to be done for the 0.1 release. And so I wanted to either get automation in place for this before 0.2, or B, have this information such that when we walk through the 0.2 release, we have what we need to be able to do that process smoothly. Bassam, did you take another look at this, or have you dug more deeply into this recently by any chance?
I have not, but I think maybe Mar could take a look at this more deeply.
Oh, okay. That sounds great. And I'll be happy to sync up with him too, since I'll be happy to run this release and, get everything out there and finalized. Probably do a blog post too. I would expect to get a little bit of noise about the release too. Mm-hmm. So I'd be happy to sync up with Mar about that. Let me just add a note real quick.
And if we do it manually, it's fine too for this release. I don't think this should be a blocker.
Right. Oops. Let me add a note about that too, just to make sure we are all in agreement there. Okie dokie. Thanks, Bassam. So this reconcile requeue patterns, Ilya, you had written a really good doc, a very thorough document about this recently, and I doubt that even the implementation is in scope for 0.2, but I just wanted to sync with you on that. if that document had been converted to like a full design markdown, or what the status of that was.
No, I haven't, because the very next control I was working on already diverged to some extent from the pattern. Well, so I think it's still a living document. I will update it as we add in more and more controllers. For now, we slowly, organically narrow it down to a pattern, but it's nothing yet to be prescriptive.
Got it.
Figure it out.
Can you go ahead and please add a link, like as a comment in this issue, to that living document so that the community can reference it when they're viewing this?
Will do.
Thank you, Ilya. Appreciate it. All right, so then this is not going to be in 0.2, so I'm going to go ahead and remove it then. But thank you for that information, Ilya. Cool. So this issue here, my original vision for it was very narrowly scoped, and this has been something that's been bothering me for a while. Like for instance, oops, sorry. When you go to our documentation, I think that the architecture document that we wrote up that explains the vision and some of the more the justification and the benefit and all this amazing content about Crossplane is a super fantastic document, and I'd like it to be more prominent. But if you go to the documentation, it's very hidden, where it's just a little link right here, that links to it. So I would like it to be more discoverable. Have like maybe a section that's architecture or vision and big words here with a link to it, just so it calls out more attention to it more easily. I had been leaving this issue open because I identified it as a good first issue where it's very simple. At least the fix that I'd like to see for this is very narrowly scoped and very easy for a community member new to the repro to pick off. But it has not gotten picked up yet, and I do want this in 0.2. So I think one of us could easily pick this off before the release. I don't think it's not necessarily a blockers and we can't release with it, but it's so trivial that I think that it should be easy to get in, and I think it has a lot of value to get more eyes on that awesome architecture and vision document that we wrote.
I could do that real quick today if you wanted.
Yeah, sure, Daniel. If you want to take that on, that would be fantastic.
Awesome.
I'll go ahead and assign that to you then, Daniel. Oops, you're Dan, right?
That's right.
Are you in the Crossplane organization?
I am not.
Oh, I'm gonna send you an invitation, man. I definitely want you to be on that. So I'll send you an invite
awesome.
So that you can join the org.
Thank you.
I thought you were already in it. I'm surprised.
I don't think I am.
Yeah, you would have shown up in the list of assignees there. Okay, I will follow up on that after the meeting as well.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you. And then we have this issue, Daniel, still in the 0.2 milestone about Azure resource groups. I think that Nick had given another round of feedback about a week ago or so. What's the status of this? And it's not a blocker for 0.2, but you've put a fair amount of work into it, so it might be nice to get it in. What's the status of that?
Definitely. So, yeah, it's fully functional. I think most of Nick's suggestions were just like kind of not necessarily bugs or anything like that, just kind of preferences. So some of those probably need to be resolved. And then the main thing is the testing isn't complete for it. And I've kind of had some sprinting to do at work recently, so I haven't been able to get to it, but I think I might actually have some time tonight. So I'm going to try to really push that through because I'd like for it to be in 0.2 if possible. But I can definitely keep you updated on that. Cool.
Yeah, that sounds good then. Thank you very much for your efforts on it, of course.
Definitely.
That's appreciated for you to get integrated into the community, and you learned a whole lot of the code base by digging into this as well, which is super useful.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so just if you by tomorrow or the day after, if you're not able to kind of converge on this and wrap it up, just leave a comment on that PR or the issue, I guess, and I'll go ahead and clear it from the milestone so it's no longer included there.
Sounds good.
Thank you, Daniel. Okay, and then the last one I had opened recently, and we'd had a bit of discussion. I think, oh, yeah, I guess it was in Slack is where it was. But just to give a little bit of background on this, because I have a fairly strong opinion on this one, where currently where we are right now in terms of the quality of the code base and the maturity of the code base is, obviously still very early. The 0.1 release was, really just a glimmer of a proof of concept. And as we continue through releases, as we go throughout the year here, we're going to be continue to run into issues in the wild with our users that we haven't seen in our testing environments or in our local environments. And as we want to increase the maturity of the project and continue to solve and unblock user-found issues, we need to have the tools to do that. And so we do a very good job right now of adding events or status conditions to the Kubernetes API objects that are related. Such, for instance, if like a GKE cluster fails to deploy, if you use kube control to look at the details of the GKE cluster object or the Kubernetes cluster resource claim, if you look at those with full details, you'll see status conditions that give insight into what has gone wrong. But in terms of a user experience, that's a bit rough, where people have to figure out what the type of the object is that they need to look at and what its name is, and look into the correct object to get the correct details, versus what I believe at this early phase of the project to be a easier ask of our users is if we log all of these failures to the central Crossplane pod logs, then at least for the current time being, all we'd have to ask our users is to do a kube control logs command, a single command that's static and doesn't change, based on what objects are in play. And we'd have a single place to look together at what the issues are and help track down some of these bugs. I know that's not the long-term solution that we want. The logs are not necessarily where we want our, the information to be captured. But right now, it feels like a very easy, consolidated place to streamline the troubleshooting efforts that we do, as a community. So maybe this isn't in scope for really taking care of in a complete way in 0.2, but I know that, when we put another release out, being able to easily troubleshoot or reduce our burden for troubleshooting as a community goes a very long way. So does anybody want to weigh in with opinions on this issue?
I just quickly chime in. I think probably Nick going to mention something. Nick put forth the logging improvement PR, which I think will add ability for us to differentiate in different levels of logging, specifically debugging in debug logging versus production run. So that will help. Again, depending on the issue, I found sometimes it challenging for logs to be very verbose, and in a sense, sometimes verbosity of the logs could be even more confusing aspect of it. When, let's say, your compiler spits out tons of repetitive same log messages and fills up your buffer, then sometimes you can say, well, what do you see in the log? And you will see something on the state of reconciler, which has already happened 10 minutes later, and it's probably not even that much useful. But again, I do understand the importance of the debugging the application, and I think what Nick put forward as a PR gives us ability to modulate between production run versus development run of a system, where we definitely can see more logs if we need to.
Yeah, expanding on what Ilya said, the PR that we touched on earlier adds the use of a proper structured log here that we just copied a pattern from the controller runtime. As a bit of a separate issue, I don't personally like the API of the logger that we used, but I think that regardless of my personal opinions about how logging APIs should look, it makes sense to use the same patterns as the controller runtime. But anyway, so that does, as earlier mentioned, give us the ability to distinguish between debug logging and regular logging. I've been a big proponent of not creating log spam. I think if you're on the fence about this, you should go and have a look at the logs from something like the controller, something like the cluster autoscaler sometime, or like, go look through the API server or something like that for a bug, and see how much log noise there is in there getting in the way. So I would strongly recommend that if we do intend to turn up our log volume, we consider doing that at the debug level. There's a lot of pretty good thinking out there within sort of the Kubernetes and SRE communities around how to do logging and what is appropriate there. I would further suggest that if we have some tentative, I think that realistically, if we put a whole bunch of logging in now, we're not going to come back and take it out at some point in the future. I don't think realistically there's going to be an action item to be like, okay, go and remove all the logging now. So I think that if we really do think that there is a better solution for this, it may be worth considering prioritizing whatever that better solution is up front.
So I think that, to be very clear, what I envision here is not necessarily, logging of, like sequential steps necessarily that creates a lot of spam for when actions are undertaken. What I'm envisioning here is that, anytime, we have a pretty consistent pattern of our controllers having a fail function that will add, a failed condition with the message or a reason for it. And that's kind of what I'm thinking would be the thing to add to logs of when there's a failure, log what that failure is too, so that it's captured in a centralized place. That has the advantage of more likely than not, it's going to be something potentially useful. It's not necessarily something that is permanently useful. Maybe a temporary condition, that's true. But failures tend to be somewhat useful. But it also has an advantage of it being easy to, if we want to sort of clean that up later on, that, there's a standardized place or a process or, location where that extra logging was added. It's added to the fail function as opposed to sprinkled throughout, reconcile loops and other random functions. So at least it's easier to know where it is. Yeah.
I think maybe a couple of words also on that. So Crossplane, it kind of shares the trait of classic Kubernetes deployment. It runs as pod and controllers. And so it's tempting to look in the pods to investigate for logging, which is great. But at the same time, Crossplane application is also a Kubernetes application, synonymous to controllers of Kubernetes infrastructure. The close analogy I could make saying that if I'm deploying something into Kubernetes and my pod is failing, probably the kubelet log or controller log is probably the last place I'll be looking at. I'll be most likely interrogating Kubernetes API to check on the status of failure of my pod. In other words, describe pod or look in the status fields in the pod or deployment and so forth. While I do understand if I'm adding functionality to Kubernetes itself, it's important to look in the logs of those controllers. In the same time, I kind of tend to treat a Crossplane as a Kubernetes entity with controllers. So I do understand if user needs to go to logs, it means that we're probably not doing a good job on reporting the status back in the primitives that we're operating on. In other words, whether it's CRD, whether it's controllers, or the other objects. In other words, users should be rarely needing to go to the log files to see and investigate things. Rather, they should be able to say, I just created the CRD get me my status. Oh, here, the failure is right here reported in the status field.
And we are doing a good job of that, but it still seems like there's, with the experience I've had with helping users troubleshoot, that there's this gap. Maybe it's an information gap, maybe it's an experience gap, where people don't know to look in these CRD objects or don't know how to find the right CRD object. It's still an experience gap there. And maybe
it is both. I think it's educational aspect. We can educate them how to do it. Saying when you submit this file, you can easily do kubectl file get and the same file, and you print all the status of all the artifacts in that file. But at the same time, it's also, you're right, it's users helping us to debug the application. In other words, we are debugging Crossplane, in which case logging is important too as well. So I see both sides of it.
I feel like, again, as sort of Ilya mentioned before, we have the ability to put on debug logging. So I would have no problem personally with having if you enable debug logging, then sure, output all the errors that you like. I think that it's important to distinguish that a lot of the things that we're talking about here are not these errors are not indicative that Crossplane is broken or has a bug or anything like that. So they're going to be showing up in the logs, and all it is potentially that we've hit a 4xx while trying to make an API call, or a password is set wrong or something like that. So I worry that if it's like printing out error statements, it's going to be confusing as to, is Crossplane broken, or have I just done something, is Crossplane working perfectly fine, but I have configured it wrong. So I don't want to be, I don't know what the word I'm looking for here is, but I think, as Ilya mentioned, it is a bit of an education problem. Software engineers, especially people who don't have a lot of background in distributed systems and things like that, I think logging is the thing. Like, logging is the way that you find out whether there is a problem in your software or not. And I think that a lot of the thinking is kind of moving away from that a little bit, and thinking a little bit more critically about how you help with the instrumentation of a system. And so the question there for us is, do we want to sort of consider those best practices, or do we want to do what people and our users expect? And how do we reconcile it if that is not exactly the same thing?
So is there... So so as stated before, we're doing a good job of capturing these failures in the CRD objects, right? So is there something cheap we can do from an education perspective of maybe like a FAQ, like a frequently asked question, or a little documentation section that's like, if something is wrong, here are a couple of pointers of, how to get the status conditions on a CRD object, or how to know which CRD object it is, and maybe approach this from a education and documentation standpoint, to help educate the user base and not go off on a path that we don't think is the long-term solution, aka adding extra logging when that's not necessarily appropriate in this ecosystem.
I mean, the way that I would address this, not having thought about it that much, but since we're talking about it at the moment, the way that I would address this is, do add the logging that you describe at debug level, so that if we want an artifact of, hey, someone's like, I don't know what's wrong with Crossplane, we can say, please enable the debug flag, send us your logs, and we have it all in one place. So, I'm all for super verbose logging in debug mode. I think that we do need to add some kind of instrumentation that is not just, well, we don't really use events at the moment, but I think we should consider using events. I think using events and statuses on objects is the sort of Kubernetes pattern to do this, that most things follow, which is a little bit tricky, because I think that does become a documentation thing, where we sort of just have to say, hey, this is the way that Kubernetes controllers typically do this. I think people who are coming from deep familiarity with Kubernetes are probably used to doing that. I personally was. It's the first place that I looked when trying to debug things. So I think that maybe, yep, some documentation would be a good pointer there, just to be like, hey, this is how this works in this world. Here's how you can get this data. And I furthermore think that we do need to consider having some kind of time series information, like, error count and things like that. Not for every individual error, but we don't have any observability apart from logging at the moment, really. So adding something like Prometheus or something like that to our binaries would be, I think, useful in this area.
Cool. Yeah, that's I agree mostly with all that. So I think potentially, so with the addition of a new logging framework that allows us to have a differentiation in logging level, that will be a help here to be able to log more verbosely, but have that behind a debug level, and then maybe a little quick section that we can refer people to easily about, looking at conditions and looking at events, etc. Could be a short-term help as well. Maybe that's just how we approach this for, a quick 0.2 thing to make the experience when we release this this version a little bit better. Cool. Any other thoughts there? That is the last issue that I had in the 0.2 milestone. Okay, so it sounds like it is perfectly attainable or doable to get push out the 0.2 release by the end of week. And we've identified all of the issues in the milestone. Are there any other issues that anybody wants to raise or call attention to for being potential blockers for 0.2? If anybody thinks of any issues, please add a comment to it on GitHub, and then we can have a discussion there about the necessity of it being included in the milestone. Okay, we can move on then. And I did not have any community topics or questions that anyone added to the document for this week. But the floor is open if anybody wants to holler and bring up a topic that they wanted to discuss. Other than that, we already discussed the Azure Resource Groups PR with Daniel. And then I opened a pull request last night just for some things that I had run into, some experience issues that I had run into while preparing a demo that we gave to SIG Apps a week or so ago. And so it's a fairly simple, pull request just to clean up the experience on a couple things. But I did run into a Jenkins build error that I have not seen before that I wanted to, maybe I have to make that bigger. I wanted to see if you guys knew anything about this or had run into this before. So it looks like when we're building the Docker, it looks like the Go binary compilation was successful, but when we're building the container image, we're running into this issue, and it's reproduced a couple of times. It seems consistent for this build. Has anybody seen this type of issue in the Docker build before?
I think I may have encountered a couple of times.
And was it a transient thing for you, Ilya, or?
Since lately it's been very consistent. I just actually rerun, after I saw your messages, I rerun a couple of times PRs and I got tripped over the same issue. I now think that it's probably something more permanent in the dependencies we're using in the Docker image. Maybe we cannot pull some of the components, but again, we need to probably look into the build submodule.
I have, thank you, Ilya. I have a very hazy recollection of this issue happening sometime in my past, or my history. I think it was in Rook. It wasn't in Crossplane. And for the life of me, I cannot recall from the deep depths of my memory there on what the root cause of this was. Doing a quick Google search for it was almost all the hits were around like mismatched carriage return line feeds, like line endings, which doesn't necessarily make sense because I don't think our Docker file has changed at all recently. I don't think we've touched it. But yeah, it's all about line endings in Windows environments and stuff like that. So I don't know if we've made any changes to our Jenkins build environment recently, or maybe that's changed. But that's basically everything Google was telling me was around line endings.
Yeah, I think we should be able to also reproduce it locally as well. So that's something we can tackle today.
Cool. Yeah, I haven't been able to reproduce it locally in my own build environment on my Mac.
This looks to me. This looks like a Docker daemon issue.
Is it potentially something that you restart the Jenkins build instance or the Docker daemon instance and it fixes itself?
Restart the slave, but like that init_linux.go is from Docker daemon.
Got it. Okay, and so yeah, I'll follow up then either with Mar or Ilya to see if we can unstick some of these pull requests, and then also if anyone could take a look at this pull request number 362 linked in the agenda notes here, that would be great because it cleans up a couple things related to the experience for 0.2. It would be nice to have that in there. Okay, so that's all I had on the agenda today. If there's anybody else that wants to bring up a topic or discussion item, the floor is open. And if not, then we can call it for today. Alrighty, then I will go ahead and stop the recording now. And thanks everybody for joining today. And by the time we meet next time, we will have a 0.2 officially released. Thanks everybody.